So to get us started, I just want to draw your attention to some types of assessment strategies that we see show up a lot in research on what works and what is best practice for assessing student learning. So within the research, there are four broad categories that have been shown time and time again to be effective ways of not only understanding what students are learning, but these strategies give you as teachers the type of data that you need to know how to differentiate your instruction or how to shift and change your instruction to be more effective and to close any learning gaps that students might have. Okay, so our first category here is summaries and reflections. Marzano, the same guy who wrote the book that we're using for this course, has also done a lot of research around instructional strategies. He's got a list, a very popular list of 9 uh, of the most effective instructional strategies, and summaries and reflections shows up on that list. So to break it down, it's when students stop and reflect, they make sense of what they have heard, what they've read, or what they've experienced, and they start to derive personal meaning from those experiences. And by doing this, they're actually increasing their metacognitive skills. So when we look at brain research, for example, it's through the process of reflection and having to put something in one's own words that the brain actually starts to create neurological connections that help embed learning within our memories and that help our brains grow in their literal understanding of new experiences, ideas, and concepts. So anytime we're asking students to summarize something that they've heard, something that they've read, something that they've experienced, and reflect on that experience, we are giving them that opportunity. We're literally giving their brains that opportunity to forge new connections and for their brains and their learning to grow. This also can be a great way to require students use academic vocabulary or content-specific language. Again, best practice and research shows us that language development happens through application and practice. And so when we're asking students to summarize an experience or reflect on an experience and write about it or speak about it, and when we ask them to or require them to use academic or content language when they do that, that's their opportunity to practice that vocabulary and become masters of the language and vocabulary that goes along with what they're learning. So lots of really great things can happen in this type of formative assessment, and that's why it shows up as number 1 on our list of assessment strategies this week. Number 2, this also shows up on Marzano's top 9 list of best instructional practices, and that is creating lists, charts, or graphic organizers. So this is when students organize different types of information based on categories, and they're asked to make decisions and justify decisions about why they're visually representing information in this way. And again, linking it back to cognitive research in our brains, this really helps students to look for and identify patterns between different types of content that they're learning and think about how might I organize it within different categories or within different lists or charts. So the internet is full of different types of graphic organizers that you can pull from as teachers to help you in thinking about how you want to structure this or what tools you want to use to help students categorize information based on what they're learning. But this is another great tool for formative assessment because as a teacher, by looking at the information that the students have laid out in their graphic organizers and how they've categorized it, how they've justified those decisions, it gives you a good sense of where their thinking is at. And it also can help reveal any misunderstandings or misconceptions that students might have about the content. Going hand in hand with that, but still broadening the category a little bit, our third item here is visual representations of information. This is when students use both words and pictures to, again, make those connections that help increase their memory, which helps facilitate retrieval of information later on. And the reason this works so well is because, again, linking it to cognition and brain research, it helps students with dual coding, which is being able to remember and think about something, not just in words, but also in pictures. And research has shown time and time again that when we can dual code something, we're much more likely to remember it and be able to recall and use it in the future. Pictures is also just a great way to make your instruction diversified and differentiate for students, whether they are language learners, whether they are students with disabilities. Whenever they can create and have these visual representations of something, that is a powerful tool for helping them learn. And again, by looking at those pictures as a teacher and by looking at the way students are connecting words to pictures, you can get a lot of really great information about how they're understanding what you're teaching them and what's making sense and what isn't, so that you can determine your next instructional steps to help support them. The last category here is collaborative activities. And this is really just a reminder to us that assessment and formative assessment doesn't always have to be an individual practice. Now, I say that with a bit of caution, because it's important that whatever our assessment strategy is, that we're able to get data from it on an individual student level. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the assessment itself has to be individualized. So when we plan collaborative activities with students where they have the opportunity to move or communicate with others, to discuss something with others, or create something with others, it's a great way for us to formatively assess them. And then we can bring in other tools like note catchers, exit tickets, forms that students fill out to make sure that we're capturing their understanding on an individual level, even though the actual activity is going to be more group-based and engaging them as in groups around that kind of conversation and collaboration. So as we wrap up this slide, this is just to give you the idea that there are so many different types of assessment strategies that are open to you as a teacher. Sometimes we tend to think we have to default to the traditional things like quizzes or assessments, or tests or essays, but really there is a whole host of different activities and engaging strategies that we can use to formatively assess students. And this slide is just meant to help us get thinking about some of those. The other point I want to make about assessments, and this also comes to us from the world of research and theory, is that all assessments are imprecise. What do we mean by that? We mean that it is impossible for any teacher to design a perfect assessment, an assessment that's going to give you a 100% accurate idea of what a student understands, what they know, and what they can be able to do. Every student, every person who goes into a situation that involves application or assessment is going to come to the table with lots of things going on, physically, emotionally, cognitively, and all of that is going to impact the performance that they have on that assessment and the types of data that we can gather from that assessment as a teacher. So it's important to remember that assessments are not, we don't want to think about using assessments to give us a 100% what we think is a 100% accurate picture of students' performance. All it's really giving us is an estimate. And from that estimate, we can ask questions and think about ways to get more information that will really help us understand what students know, what they are able to do, and what learning gaps they might have that we can then begin closing as teachers. So I've included a list here of just some of the many things that can happen that we call errors in assessment. And that can include anything from the test design itself, so how a teacher has worded a task, how that's actually been typed out on paper, are there spelling mistakes, is the language just not making sense? Lots of opportunities for error within the test design that will impact the quality of the data that we gather from that assessment. Similarly, students may just have a misunderstanding about one of the items on a test, the instructions that they're given when they're performing the test, and that is another source of error that we want to be looking for and be aware of as teachers. Third, we know that students, their motivation fluctuates, and students may lack the effort or motivation to do well or perform well on assessment day, on test day. So the timing in which we're giving our assessments can also be important based on, are students really tired at the end of the day? If we're giving an assessment at the end of a school day when they're tired, when they're hungry, they may really lack effort and motivation. And so the data we gather from that assessment may not really give us a true sense of how students are performing. So we want to be thoughtful of that when we think about not only the types of assessments we're giving, but the timing around the assessments and how that can change based on students' effort and motivation. Fourth, once we actually have given the assessment and we're looking at the data, there are lots of opportunities for us to misinterpret something about the data or the information that students are giving us. For example, we may read a student response to an assessment we've designed in which we ask them to just write a short answer to a question. Maybe it's about a piece of content or an activity they did. And our interpretation of that student's writing may be completely off. It may not be what the student meant to communicate at all, but when we're reading it, usually alone at the end of the day or at night when we're grading something, we may completely misunderstand or misinterpret what it is a student is trying to say. So it's important that we're building in opportunities as teachers to connect back with students and ask them clarifying questions or giving them multiple opportunities to articulate their understanding of something so that we can limit and reduce this threat of misinterpretation when we're looking at the data from our assessments. Fifth, there can be language or culture gaps that arise, and these are great examples of how bias can creep into our assessments. So depending on the wording that we're choosing when we're creating an item for a test or when we're creating a prompt for students to respond to as part of our assessment, there might be certain words in there that students can misunderstand or that they might not know at all based on their own language and culture. And so again, we want to be thoughtful about that within our design of assessments as teachers and try to reduce any opportunity for language bias that may creep into that process. So all of this is to say that when we have assessments, even good assessments, it means that only limited inferences can be made from a single test. This is why when we're building our learning progressions, we're thinking about not just assessing something once as part of a unit, but actually building in opportunities for students to practice and assessing them multiple times throughout the unit to be certain that they either get something or that we're getting enough information about what they don't get throughout the unit to be able to make decisions, make changes, and improve the quality of our instruction. And finally, before we jump into what this is going to look like for this week's assignment, I just want to take this opportunity to once again distinguish between what we refer to as formative assessments and summative assessments. So within your unit designs and within your learning progressions, you're going to be using both. The summative assessment is going to come at the end of your learning progression. So that'll be the final assessment that you will use to determine how well students have met the criteria within your standard. Okay, and so the summative assessment can either accompany the last step of your learning progression, or it can be like a big project or something that takes into account all of the different steps within your learning progression, but through that culminating activity at the end that will define your summative assessment. Okay, so here we just have that defined as the summative assessment is the formal assessment conducted at the end of the learning process. It doesn't occur while learning is taking place, and it typically involves multiple probes or more complex tasks that students are doing simultaneously at the end of a unit or lesson. So some ideas about this might be your traditional paper pencil tests, culminating projects, presentations, traditional exams, constructed responses like long essays or papers, or independent application tasks or activities that students are completing at the end of your learning progression or unit. And then everything that happens before that, so everything that you want to think about building for each step of your learning progression will fall under this category of formative assessment. And those are the formal or informal assessments that we conduct during the learning process. So these are those checks for understanding. These are those ways of being able to tell, did students get what I wanted them to take away from my lesson today? Did they master the skill I was going after within my objective? Or did they have trouble with it? And what data are they giving me about the trouble that they might be having? And what do I need to do about that as a teacher? So these formative assessments typically don't require a disruption to the learning process. other than to just take the time to complete the task or complete the check for understanding. But there is a list that I will include on Blackboard that will give you a whole host of formative assessment strategies that you can think about using for your learning progressions for the assignment this week. All right, so that brings us then to what is the next step for your learning progressions? Well, each of you has now clearly laid out and defined the different steps in your learning progression, and I've given you feedback on those, as I said in the beginning. And so now you're going to give some thought to, all right, how is it that you're going to assess and gather data around student performance on each of those steps within your learning progression? And so for this week's assignment, you're simply going to tell me for each step of your learning progression, what formative assessment strategy are you going to use to gather some data around student performance on that? And then what justification are you using for those strategies? So notice on my example here, and this is the same example that we saw in last week's PowerPoint, I've just indicated within the stars what my formative assessment strategy is going to be for each of these steps in my learning progression. So if you look, for example, at the first step, here, remember my student learning outcome was that they will be able to draw a basic number line and label it from 0 to 10. I can use a simple exit ticket or a note card to assess how well students can perform on this objective. I'll simply distribute the note card to them at the end of the lesson, ask them to draw a basic number line and label it from 0 to 10. I'll of course ask each student to put their name on that card, and then I will collect those cards back from them at the end of the lesson, and that right there gives me the data I need to look at how well each student can perform on this learning outcome. I can use each student's response to see, are they correctly drawing a number line? Are they correctly labeling it from 0 to 10? And this will help me see, are there students who are struggling with this in some way? So for example, when I look at how they're labeling the actual pieces of the number line, I'm going to check, are there relatively even spaces between each number on the number line? Or are they leaving these uneven gaps between numbers? That'll tell me how well students are understanding the reason and the importance of labels on a number line. Okay, if we think of a number line labeled from 0 to 10, each number should have approximately the same distance between it to indicate that the quantity is the same and the distance between those numbers is the same from one to another on a number line. If students aren't showing me that on their work, that's a cue to me as a teacher that that's something I need to go back and reteach or clarify as part of my next lesson or ongoing instruction as part of the unit. Okay, and you can see I've done that same type of thinking with each step on this sample learning progression. I've simply indicated on the stars what my formative assessment strategy is going to be. This is what you all are going to do and submit to Blackboard this week as your assignment for this class.